Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, Kenyan Vice President William Ruto looks set to become president after the Supreme Court unanimously rejects challenges to election results that delivered him his win last month. His unsuccessful rival, Raila Odinga, says that he will accept the decision. Also, 3 Ivorian soldiers are back home after having spent almost 2 months in detention in Mali. 46 of their countrymen are still jailed there, caught in the midst of ongoing tensions between Bamako and the international community. And the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Programme pledges $25 billion for the continent's climate battle. But at a Rotterdam summit looking at Africa's needs ahead of COP27, African leaders slam many of their European counterparts for their no-show for the crucial conversations. But first, Kenya's Supreme Court has found little or no evidence of alleged irregularities in last month's presidential election and has unanimously rejected challenges from unsuccessful candidate Raila Odinga. He lost out to Vice President William Ruto, who says that he hopes that the court ruling over the August 9th vote will draw a line under the otherwise peaceful election.
This afternoon, with the unanimous decision of the Supreme Court of Kenya, our lengthy, suspenseful, and protracted election has come to an end. After the results of the vote were declared, it was taken up before the Supreme Court for scrutiny to make sure, beyond all doubt, that the will of the people had prevailed. The court returned its verdict, and I welcome it with tremendous humility.
Odinga said that he will respect the court's opinion. Ivorian Wandera has more.
The judgment was delivered in 80 minutes by Chief Justice Martha Koome, who said the judges made a unanimous decision to uphold Deputy President William Ruto's win of the August 9th presidential election. The Chief Justice continued to state that the petitioners failed to prove that the election was tampered with and that the Electoral Commission did not hold the election in a constitutional manner. Shortly after making the judgment, former opposition leader Raila Odinga released a statement to say that he disagrees with the decision of the court but respects it, and Deputy President William Ruto addressed the nation and his supporters. Listen to some of them.
All the government machinery, all ministers, who was with Raila. But it has happened that you can be a president by common people, by telling people the message you want.
And for someone like him, coming from nowhere, and in a poor state of life, to be a president gives them a lot of hope to so many Kenyans.
Ruto, while addressing his supporters, thanked them for voting for him and supporting him and campaigning for him in the grassroots, and said that he will work tirelessly during his tenure to ensure that he fulfills the promises that he made to them. The president-elect also said that he will be making a phone call to Uhuru Kenyatta and speak to him about his win, and said that they have not spoken in a couple of months. The president-elect will now be sworn in on the 13th of September as Kenya's 5th president.
Ivorian Wandera there for us. Now, 46 Ivorian soldiers are still being held in Mali after 3 of their number were released as a humanitarian gesture over the weekend. All of the soldiers have been held since July, when they were sent in by a private UN contractor and then arrested by Malian authorities who say that they're mercenaries. Sophie Lamotte has more.
3 women amongst the 49 Ivorian soldiers detained in Mali were released this weekend. They landed in the Abidjan airport and were welcomed by their families and a military delegation on Saturday evening. Here in Abidjan, authorities remain hopeful and have said that negotiations mediated by Togo are still underway to get the remaining 46 Ivorian soldiers back onto Ivorian soil. A hopeful message that was echoed by the Burkinabe president, Damiba, who was on an official visit to Abidjan on Monday after he traveled to Mali this weekend. And he called upon all parties to find a way to work together and to stand united in the face of the threat of terrorism that has paralyzed most of Mali, Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire in the last few years. So the release of these soldiers does signal that both parties might be willing to work to ease tensions. However, the details of this deal do remain unknown, and it's unclear under what conditions Mali might release these remaining soldiers and when they too might be able to return to Côte d'Ivoire.
Sophie Lamotte there for us. Now, African leaders have criticised the absence of European and Western leaders at a key summit in Europe ahead of the November COP27 climate conference in Egypt. Now, Monday's meeting in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, was aimed at raising the vast funds needed for Africa's adaptation to the ravages of climate change caused by CO2 emissions from mostly industrialised nations.
Europe, the United States, and China, they are responsible for pollution and global warming. But we are on the same planet, and now they ask us to adapt, not to follow their path of pollution.
Well, rich countries and the African Development Bank have pledged about $25 billion by 2025 to boost Africa's adaptation efforts, but the continent warns that the scale of the challenges means that it's still nowhere near enough. Our Mark Perelman headed to Rotterdam for us. He tells us more.
As we enter the last stretch of negotiations before COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, leaders of Africa and Europe converge here in Rotterdam to discuss the issue of climate adaptation. This is absolutely key if Africa is to fight efficiently climate change. And one of the protagonists today was the Director General of the World Trade Organization, and she claimed that free trade was not the enemy of the fight against climate change. Let's take a listen.
It is true that many people think trade contributes to the problem of carbon emissions because of the logistics of trade and other aspects of trade. And it's true, but it is also true that trade is part of the solution. And that is what is so important, that we need to look at trade differently. What can trade bring to solving decarbonization of the world? And there are several things. We strongly believe that without trade and the support of the WTO getting involved in this, efforts at adaptation will not be as efficient. Just think about it. Trade is a tool for adaptation. It is through trade that you transmit technologies, ideas and knowledge, goods and services that allow countries to adapt, to learn from best practice in one part of the world to another. Just also think of this. If you have a climate event in which half of your country is inundated, or 1/3 like Pakistan, without trade, you will not be able to take care of the needs of the people. You need to move goods from one part of the world to the other in order to be able to take care of people. So thinking about trade, it's essential to make sure it's mainstreamed into adaptation. Lastly, we talk about finance, and it's critically important. Here at the Global Center on Adaptation, we're talking about how to mobilize finance for Africa's adaptation. But there's one non-financial issue, which has to do with trade. If you have finance, but you have countries that put in export restrictions, not allowing the goods which finance can pay for to help you with adaptation to move, then you have a problem. Do you remember the pandemic? There were many countries that had resources, money, COVAX, for developing countries had money. But because of export restrictions on vaccines, countries not allowing the export of vaccines or inputs to make vaccines, people could not access these vaccines. So getting WTO members to accept that there will be little restriction, there will be freer flow of trade on things that concern climate and concern adaptation. And that is critically important. Otherwise, you will not be able to move, and it will be so much more difficult.
Right. What do you make of the financial gap? I mean, African leaders here and elsewhere have denounced the little money that's put for adaptation because of COVID, because of Ukraine. How serious of a problem is it, and why aren't Western countries more responsive?
It's a very serious problem. I think there's a serious trust deficit for the 100 billion that had been promised a long time ago. I think up to 79 billion have now been mobilized, which is good. We will see what the latest report will say at COP27, whether we'll get to the 100. But it's taking so long, and we know that that is just the beginning, just a little of what is needed. And the adaptation, financing for adaptation is not receiving as much support as mitigation. Africa, for instance, has a $40 billion gap, of which, for over the next several years, of which the Global Center for Adaptation with African leaders and the African Development Bank are trying to mobilize, and the international community, all of us, trying to mobilize 25 billion, 60% of it, to see if we can get adaptation investments strengthened. Without it, it will be extremely difficult. You know that Africa has 80% of the people at risk of being badly affected by climate change, according to the IPCC latest report. So this is a serious issue. We must put strong effort behind mobilizing the finance, and we must put strong effort in making sure that once this finance is available, we also do not restrict access to the goods and services needed for adaptation. We must allow trade to flow.
Right, as the last question, do you believe Africans are losing faith in free trade, in donor funding, and so on and so forth?
I think Africans are seeing that global solidarity is not as strong as they would like to see. It's not as strong as the promises and the talk. I think because of the multiple shocks that the world is going through, Europe is struggling with very high energy prices at the moment and worrying about the winter. Other parts of the world are struggling with their issues. And that is totally understandable. Politicians have to take care of the immediate environment. But let's remember, there was a very good quote here that was said by Franz Timmermans, the first vice president of the Commission. And he said, if Africa does not succeed, Europe does not succeed. That is a very powerful statement. So even as we struggle with all the problems we have to face domestically, we need to know that without global solidarity, we also really will not succeed. We have problems of the global commons, of which climate change is one, and no one country can solve it alone. No one country can think that I will just take care of myself and everything will be fine, because it won't.
That interview there conducted by Mark Perlman, and those powerful words from the DG of the World Trade Organization, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Now, African agriculture and food security has been greatly undermined by climate change. One of the adaptation strategies being considered is greater use of genetically modified crops. In June, Senegal controversially authorized the use of GMO seeds for the first time. Our correspondents report.
Aissatou Diouf is a seed specialist at this organic farm outside Dakar.
This is where we stock the seeds from the farm.
She is worried about a new law that authorizes the use of GMO crops in Senegal. Genetically modified seeds often turn sterile, meaning farmers have to buy more each harvest. Multinational companies can cash in.
I'm able to produce my own seeds, which remain reproductive over a long time period. These GMO crops could cross-pollinate with my plants, and that will diminish the genetic integrity of my stock. The seeds will mutate and develop other genes.
Rahim Ba set up this farm 5 years ago and teaches students in methods of agroecology.
You need good crop rotation. This allows us to get a good vegetable harvest.
GMO seeds often produce high yields in the short term, but these diminish significantly over time. Rahim believes the new law will have disastrous consequences.
They think that GMO agriculture can feed the world. Maybe at the beginning it can. But in the long term, it's not sustainable. The answer is agroecology, which allows us to be sovereign, autonomous, and have food security.
Senegalese President Macky Sall is convinced that GMO crops will prove a useful tool in adapting to climate change. But despite multiple requests for interviews, none of his government ministers were willing to defend the controversial new law on camera.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Till then, take care.
Hello, I'm Annette Young, the host of The 51%. In this week's special edition, we're here in Scotland, whose haunting beauty often provides a backdrop to many TV series and films about witchcraft and sorcery, such as Harry Potter and Outlander. But back in the 16th century, a true horror tale began in this country when thousands of Scots, predominantly women, met their deaths after being accused of being witches. Now, 400 years later, the Scottish Parliament is being asked to clear their names.
The 51%, presented by Annette Young on France 24 and France24.com.